This is Mrs. Miller, your teacher at ELA Academy. Welcome to Essay Basics Part 9, Introductions. We're almost done with this series, so let's look back for a moment on what we've covered so far. We've looked at the 4 primary modes of writing, how to structure your essay effectively, how to come up with ideas to write about, how to develop your body paragraphs in more detail, and the body paragraph demonstration videos, narrative, descriptive, expository, and argument. I bring this up because I suspect some viewers might land here first, intending to work on their introductions before writing the rest of the essay. I put intros and conclusions last because I think they're easier to write once you have the body worked out. But to tell the truth, the writing process is really flexible. It's just fine if you want to start with the first sentence and write straight through to the end. That might help you maintain a smooth train of thought. Or you might write some ideas for the body, try to come up with something interesting for the intro, work on the body some more, write the intro and conclusion, then finish the body. Or get halfway through and realize you don't like the idea, scrap it, and start over. But whatever order you address the paragraphs, I do think you should watch the intro and conclusion videos before writing either of those paragraphs. They'll be much more powerful if you have a plan for making them work together. Before we talk about the structure of an introduction, let's talk about my favorite kind of intro, the full circle. It's a style that ties the intro and conclusion together by using a powerful image or idea. You'll want to select something that helps to illustrate the point you're making in your essay, of course. One of the examples I'll show you later is an essay about risks where I used the movie The Walk, which is about a man who walked across a high wire strung between the 2 towers of the old World Trade Center in New York. In the intro, I told a little anecdote about the movie, talked about a risk I took in the body paragraphs, and then talked about the movie again in the conclusion. As I said, there are other types of intros and conclusions, but I'm focusing on this one because I think it's very powerful. I'll show you a couple of examples later. Now let's look at the basic structure of an intro. This applies whether you do a full circle or not. You'll want to start with a hook, which is a sentence that grabs the reader's attention. Just like a fish hook with a nice juicy worm stops a fish in its tracks and keeps it there. Then you'll want to provide some background or context. Think of it as a way to get your reader up to speed before you dig into the details of your topic. And then you'll need a thesis statement, which is the main idea of your essay. It might be a truism, which is kind of like a life lesson, or it might simply be your answer to the writing prompt. Now let's look at these 3 elements in more detail. We won't look at all the different types of hooks you might use in this video, but I'll provide plenty of resources on my blog post. Just click the link in the video description below. What's really important to understand is that all types of hooks can be used poorly or well, so we'll look at a couple of hook types done both ways. These examples will all be related to the prompt, why is it important to take risks? The first type of hook we'll look at is the question. What you want to avoid is asking a question that just restates the prompt. People do this a lot more often than you might think, or otherwise just asking a lame question. So, why are risks important and what are risks are not very effective hooks. They're the equivalent of a fish hook with no worm on it. Here are a few better ways to ask questions. When does the risk outweigh the reward? From there, I might talk about somebody pulling a stunt, like walking a high wire at the top of the World Trade Center with no safety net. In that case, I would think that no amount of excitement or attention from the media would be worth the risk of falling. The risk outweighs the reward. How about this? Why do some people seem drawn to taking risks? That might open up an interesting discussion on adrenaline addiction and how it might cloud a person's judgment. Here's another one. Are American parents too focused on safety? You might talk about how some parents seem to protect their children so carefully that those children don't really know how to take care of themselves when they grow up. Notice that the questions in the more effective column are a lot more specific than the less effective ones. Now let's look at the definition hook. Again, this one is very, very common. Webster's dictionary defines a risk as something. This definition really isn't needed because most English-speaking people know what risks are. How can we do this better? Adrenaline increases a person's heart rate, blood pressure, and metabolism in response to a stressful situation. Adrenaline is a much more specific thing to define than a risk. Most people are aware of adrenaline, but this definition highlights specific effects that you could then discuss as part of the background. You might go on to talk about adrenaline junkies who become addicted to the thrill that goes along with the increased heart rate and blood pressure. It makes them feel more alive, so they're more likely to take risks in order to get that shot of excitement. So again, like with the question examples, we see that it's better to address something very specific that helps you lead into an interesting discussion. The hooks in the left-hand column really don't lead anywhere. The ones on the right do. Now let's talk about background. Ideally, the hook and the background will work together. Did you notice on the last slide that I kind of already talked about the background that might follow each hook? So if you use the hook about adrenaline, you might talk about adrenaline addiction for the background. If you ask the question about whether American parents are too focused on safety, you might describe some of the precautions they take that you believe are excessive. If you use an anecdote like I did with the movie The Walk, just make sure the first sentence is interesting. That'll be your hook. Just remember, make sure there's some powerful image or idea, like the guy on the high wire or adrenaline junkies or parents putting leashes on their children, that you can return to in the conclusion. Last but certainly not least, you need a thesis statement. This is where you clearly communicate the main idea of your whole paper. There are many effective ways to write a thesis statement, but we'll focus on the ones I usually teach. Again, you'll find more resources on the blog post linked below. Let's keep working with the same prompt. Why is it important to take risks? The easiest thing to do is just answer the prompt. So we might write, it is important to take risks because life itself is risky. If we take no risks, then we aren't really living. This isn't my favorite type because guess what happens if every student uses it? I get to read the words, it's important to take risks because, about 200 times. Boring. But guess what? You can use this as a way to get something written down and then see what happens if you take the words from the prompt out of it. In this case, it actually turns into the next type of thesis, the truism or life lesson. Let's see what that looks like. Life itself is risky. If we take no risks, then we aren't really living. That's much nicer, don't you think? A very traditional alternative is claim plus reasons. Each of those reasons would then be the main idea of a body paragraph. Personally, I prefer this one for analytical papers, like the ones you would write for AP Lang or Lit. Here's an example. Willingness to take risks is critical. Few worthwhile opportunities in life come without risks, but more importantly, a time of crisis may present nothing but risky solutions, in which case the overly cautious person might be unable to make a decision. Notice that this thesis statement is actually 2 sentences instead of 1. In general, that's fine, but check with your teacher or professor. Some insist on a 1-sentence thesis. All right, let's look at those examples I promised you. Remember that we're focusing on the full circle, so you'll want to watch the next video to see how I return to each of these ideas in the conclusions. Let's look first at the intro for the expository essay I wrote for Essay Basics Part 7. This is my essay about the importance of taking risks. According to some reports, movie theater ushers passed out in droves during screenings of The Walk, a movie based on the true story of a man who walked a high wire strung between the 2 towers of the World Trade Center. I had to close my eyes every time the trailer came on because the first-person shot of that long drop made my head spin. Most people think the main character was foolish in the extreme for taking such an unnecessary risk just for the sake of adrenaline or the desire to prove himself or the thirst for fame. But in a way, our society has become so risk-averse that we may be missing out on great opportunities as a result of our desire for safety. Notice that I'm using an anecdote in the beginning, so the hook and the background are sort of rolled together. Here's the hook, which is interesting because it has a surprising fact. People don't normally pass out in theaters, so readers will be inclined to keep reading in order to see why. Here's the background, which gives more information about the movie, but only the most relevant part, the risk and how it makes even the viewers feel dizzy. It also gives some context for the opposition, people looking at a risk that somebody took and judging it for being foolish and unnecessary. And here's the thesis statement, which explains why taking risks is important, because great opportunities are often risky. Remember, we're also looking at a full circle, which means I'll come back to an important image or idea in the conclusion. In this case, I'll use the high wire as a metaphor for a risk that I took. Now let's look at the argument essay I wrote for Essay Basics Part 8. This is one where I'm talking about the value of video games. Here's the intro. A coffee table sits littered with empty cans of Fanta grape soda and a haphazard stack of paper plates containing pizza crusts and sandwich corners. Tangled wires swarm from the TV to the couch, and various controllers rest on either side of a butt-shaped depression in the cushion. Crumbs nest in every crevice. A nearly empty bag of Doritos slumps on the floor. Curtains jealously guard the room from sunlight, and the air is fetid with the smell of old food and unwashed teenage boy. This is the den of a gamer. Society tends to hold up this stereotype as evidence of the dissipated lifestyle we can expect as the natural outcome of gaming. But I contend that we are vastly underestimating the benefits that video games offer. Notice that I used the descriptive mode in this intro. Again, the description has the hook and background all rolled together. Here's the hook, which is interesting because it's such a vivid description. Notice how specific it is. I didn't just say, hey, we're looking at a really messy game room. Instead, I used the most specific details that I could. Instead of soda, I used Fanta grape soda. Instead of leftover food, I mentioned pizza crusts and sandwich corners. The sentence is also powerful because it implies something about the person who spends time in this room. He or she spends a lot of time there eating and drinking unhealthy stuff and rarely cleans up the mess. Here's the background, which gives more information about the game room, painting a vivid picture that will leave an impression. I'm particularly fond of the butt-shaped depression in the cushion. And here's the thesis statement. Notice that I start by pointing out that the description you just finished reading is a common stereotype of gamers, and it's seen as a sign of a larger problem, an irresponsible lifestyle that doesn't contribute to society. But my thesis statement makes an impression because I contradict that bias and say something that won't be very popular with the generation of parents trying to get those kids off the couch, that we're underestimating the value of video games. Now, this essay does have a full circle, but I didn't locate the full circle idea in the first paragraph. Instead, it's at the end of the second paragraph. But notice that the second paragraph sort of expands on the point of view that gaming is bad. It's about how addictive games are. So it's almost like an extension of the intro. What will they do when they grow up? What kind of job could they possibly qualify for? Play video games for 8 hours straight doesn't appear in many job descriptions. This is the idea that will appear again in the conclusion. Both of these essays will be attached to the blog post in case you'd like to look at them more closely. And remember, we'll look at how we complete the full circle in the next video. I hope this has helped you understand introductions a little better. Don't forget to watch the next video on conclusions so that you can see how they work together. Be sure to subscribe to my channel and follow me on Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest. And of course, you can find supplementary materials for each and every video at elaacademy.us. This is ELA Academy.